6 months. That was how long the dog had been missing, and every professional tracker who tried had come back with nothing. No trail, no signal from the old chip, nothing but an empty kennel run and a name nobody at the base said out loud anymore, because saying it had stopped feeling like hope and started feeling like picking at a wound. Then on a gray Tuesday morning, a woman wiping down the counter of a roadside cafe 2 miles from the base fence set her rag down mid-motion, looked up at a customer who had just mentioned the dog's name in passing, and said 5 words that made the whole room go quiet. I know where he is. Before we get into it, tell me where you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever known something nobody else could see, hit subscribe, because this story was made for people like you. The cafe sat where the county road bent around a stand of old oak trees, close enough to the base that half its regulars wore some version of a uniform, and the other half serviced the people who did. Maren Voss had been pouring coffee there for a year and 8 months, and in that time she had built herself into something the regulars trusted without examining too closely. She was 34, 5'7", lean and economical in her movements, with a face people described as calm rather than pretty, though it was both. Her hair was dark blonde, always pulled into a low knot. She had a thin old scar along the inside of her right forearm that she kept covered with her sleeve out of habit rather than shame, and she moved through the cafe the way some people move through a room they've already mapped in the dark, without wasted motion, always aware of the door. Nobody at the cafe knew that 11 years earlier, Maren had been an operational Navy combat medic attached to a joint canine handling program, one of the rare cross-trained specialists who could treat a wounded operator and a wounded working dog with equal skill, because the two were so often brought in on the same stretcher. She did not talk about it. When customers asked why a woman her age had ended up pouring coffee 2 miles from a base fence, she told them she liked the quiet, and that was true enough that she never had to elaborate. She had left the program without ceremony and had kept a silence around those years the way other people keep a garden, carefully, daily, without letting it show. The base had a canine transfer and training facility just past the tree line, and in her time at the cafe, Maren had listened to 100 conversations about dogs she would never meet, washouts and success stories, the ordinary gossip of a close professional world. She had trained herself not to react to any of it, because reacting was a habit that got noticed. But 6 months ago, one name had started appearing in those conversations, and every time she heard it, something in her chest tightened in a way she had to work to keep off her face. Bishop, a Belgian Malinois, 3 years into an advanced detection and protective hold rotation, had gone missing during a joint field exercise near the Eastern Training Range. Not killed, not confirmed dead, simply gone. Slipped his lead during a controlled chaos scenario when a transport vehicle backfired and the exercise dissolved into noise and dust for 40 seconds too long. 6 months of searching by professional trackers, drone sweeps, and volunteer patrols had turned up nothing. The chip in his shoulder had gone dark within the first week. The base had quietly begun treating it as a loss. Nobody used the word dead. They used the word unrecoverable, which was worse in its own way, because it left the door open just enough to keep hurting. Maren had heard the name Bishop for the first time on a Thursday morning in early spring, from 2 handlers arguing about search grid patterns over eggs at her counter, and she had felt the floor tilt slightly under her without moving an inch. She knew that name. She had known it for 11 years, from a different base, a different program, a different life she had left behind so completely that hearing it now felt at first like a coincidence too strange to be real. It took her 3 days of careful, quiet questions to confirm what she suspected. This bishop was not the bishop she had known. It was a namesake, given by a handler who'd served under someone who'd served under someone who told the old stories. The realization should have closed the door on whatever had opened in her chest that morning. Instead, it opened a different one, because in learning this bishop's story, in listening to 6 months of fragments about his handling history and his specific, unusual training profile, Maren started to understand something the professional trackers did not know to look for, because they had never been the kind of medic who learned to read a dog's whole life from a single scar and a single behavioral tick. If you've ever pieced together the truth from fragments other people walked right past, comment the words, "I see it" below, because that instinct is exactly what this story is about. The dog's handler was a staff sergeant named Cole Rayner, 29 years old, tall and raw-boned, his face gone gaunt over 6 months of searching, his dark hair kept in a tight cut that was starting to grow out because he'd stopped caring enough to get it trimmed. He had a habit of rubbing his left thumb across his knuckles when he talked about the dog, an old nervous tell everyone on base had learned to recognize and quietly ignore. He wore his uniform even on his off hours, because changing out of it felt like giving up the search, and Cole Rayner was not a man built to give up on the animal he had raised from an 8-week-old pup into the most capable detection dog his unit had ever fielded. He came into Marin's cafe most mornings, ordered the same black coffee, and sat by the window with a folded topographic map marked so many times the creases were starting to tear. Marin watched him for months before she said anything, not because she doubted what she suspected, but because she understood, in a way most people didn't, exactly how much damage false hope could do to a person already worn down to the frame. She had seen it in field hospitals. Families told their soldier might make it when the odds said otherwise, and she had learned that hope offered carelessly was its own kind of cruelty. So she waited, and she listened to every detail Cole Rayner and the other handlers let slip about Bishop's temperament, his training quirks, the particular sound signal his old training program had used before the current one, because dogs like Bishop were sometimes cross-trained between programs and carried old conditioning forward the way people carry old habits into new lives. It was a Tuesday morning, 6 months and 4 days after Bishop went missing, when Cole Rayner sat down at his usual window seat, unfolded his map for what felt like the 1,000th time, and said to the handler across from him, more to the air than to anyone in particular, that the search coordinator wanted to close the file at the end of the month. Not officially declare the dog dead, just stop actively searching, reallocate the resources, treat it as a loss the base could no longer justify chasing. He said it in the flat, exhausted voice of a man who had run out of ways to argue against something he knew was probably the right call, and hated anyway. Marin was wiping down the counter 3 feet away, and her hand stopped moving. She had spent 6 months keeping a careful, deliberate silence, telling herself that being right about a dog's behavioral pattern didn't make her right about where he'd gone, that stepping forward meant opening a door on her own cast she'd kept shut for over a decade. But hearing Cole Rayner's voice crack slightly on the word close, watching his thumb move against his knuckles in that same old tell, something in her recalculated the cost of staying quiet. She set the rag down on the counter, and she said, "I know where he is." The cafe went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when someone says something too large for the space they set it in. Cole Rayner looked up from his map like he hadn't understood the words. The other handler at his table actually laughed, a short, reflexive sound, the laugh of a man who'd spent 6 months hearing false leads from well-meaning strangers with nothing real to offer. Marin didn't flinch. She had expected it. Cole Rayner didn't laugh. He set his coffee down carefully, the way a man sets something down when his hands aren't entirely steady, and he asked her, quietly, how a cafe waitress would know anything about a classified training program's missing detection asset. Marin looked at him for a long moment, weighing 11 years of silence against the look on his face, and then she said, "Because I used to do the same work you do, a long time ago. Different program, different base. And I've been listening to every word your team has said about that dog for 6 months, and none of you have been looking in the right kind of place, because none of you have been trained to think the way he was trained to think. If you've ever had to decide whether the truth was worth the cost of telling it, drop the words "worth it" in the comments right now, because that was exactly the decision sitting on Marin's shoulders in that moment. Cole Rayner didn't ask for her credentials. He looked at her the way a drowning man looks at a rope he isn't sure will hold, and he asked her what she meant by the right kind of place. Marin pulled out the chair across from him without being invited, and asked him to tell her again, slowly, everything about how Bishop had been trained before this program, because fragments weren't enough to be certain, and she needed to be certain before sending a search team somewhere new on nothing but a hunch. Cole Rayner talked for 20 minutes about Bishop's early training under a different handler in a different program, one focused not on detection, but on a rarer specialty, protective positioning over a downed operator, the same specialty Marin had once worked alongside herself. The dog had been reassigned to detection work after that first handler rotated out, adapting well enough on paper, but always carrying old behaviors nobody in the current program fully understood. a tendency to seek elevated, enclosed positions when stressed, and a specific two-note whistle he still responded to that nobody on base knew how to reproduce. Marin felt the pieces settle into place with the quiet certainty of someone recognizing a language she hadn't spoken in over a decade but had never actually forgotten. She asked where the search teams had concentrated their efforts, and he described a wide radius pattern, standard protocol, open terrain, tree lines, water sources, anywhere a stress detection dog might range looking for food. Standard protocol for a detection dog, Marin said, but that's not what he is underneath the retraining. If he's carrying his original conditioning, he wouldn't have run. He would have gone to ground, enclosed, elevated, defensible. Somewhere he could hold a position and wait for the right signal, because that's what he was built for before anyone taught him to sniff out explosives for a living. She asked if there was any structure near the original search perimeter that was elevated, enclosed, defensible, something a dog trained to hold position over a down operator might read as worth guarding. Cole Rayner went still and said there was an old fire watch tower just outside the search radius, technically outside the exercise boundary, which was exactly why nobody had thought to search it. If you've ever watched an entire team look everywhere except the one place that actually mattered, comment the words "right there," because Marin was about to prove that instinct was worth more than protocol. Marin explained that protocol assumed a detection dog's instincts, not a protective hold dog's, and that if Bishop had been frightened by the backfire, his oldest, deepest conditioning might have overridden 6 months of newer training, sending him toward exactly the kind of position his original handler had spent his earliest months teaching him to seek. If she was right, he wouldn't come to just anyone, because protective hold dogs were conditioned to wait for a very specific signal telling them it was safe enough to stand down. Cole Rayner asked her very quietly if she knew that signal. Marin didn't answer right away. Answering meant admitting the actual truth of who she had been, not the vague non-answers she gave curious customers. She looked at the torn map on the table, at the thumb still moving against his knuckles, at 6 months of exhaustion carved into a face too young to look that tired, and she made the decision that had been building in her for months. "I don't know his signal," she said, "but I know how the program that trained him builds those signals, because it's the same program that trained me, on a different dog a long time ago, and if you'll let me come with you, I might be able to reach him, even if he won't come to a stranger." Cole Rayner's face shifted from cautious hope into something closer to belief, and he said the only thing that mattered, which was okay. He was already reaching for his phone to call in a team, and Marin was untying her apron in the middle of a shift for the first time in a year and 8 months, walking out toward a truck idling in the gravel lot. The drive took 40 minutes, up a switchback road that hadn't been maintained in years, the last quarter mile covered on foot. Cole Rayner brought 2 other handlers and a search coordinator named Ruiz, whose polite skepticism was the look of a man who'd learned to humor promising leads without investing hope in them. Marin said almost nothing on the drive, running through 11-year-old memory the way she used to run through medical protocols before a mission. The tower stood at the top of the ridge, weathered gray wood on iron stilts, 4 stories with a single narrow stairwell, exactly the kind of elevated, defensible position Marin had described back in the cafe. Ruiz said quietly they'd need to clear it floor by floor, standard protocol, and Marin said no, not yet, because 6 people going in loud with flashlights and radio chatter would read as exactly the threat his old conditioning had trained him to hold position against. She asked for 5 minutes alone at the base of the stairwell, and Ruiz looked ready to argue until Cole Rayner said, quietly but with a weight that closed the conversation, "Let her try." Marin stood at the bottom of the stairwell in the gray afternoon light, 6 months of gathered fragments and 11 years of buried training converging on a single moment. She put 2 fingers to her lips and thought about the specific rhythm the old program had used, 2 short notes and 1 long one held steady, a pattern that meant, in the language these dogs were built to understand before anyone narrowed their training, "It's safe. I'm the one who fixes things. You can stand down now." She whistled at once into the silence of the ridge. Nothing happened, and the silence stretched long enough that she heard Ruiz shift his weight behind her, the sound of a man's patience running out. If you've ever put everything into one moment with no guarantee it would work, comment the words "I understand" below, because that was exactly where Marin stood in that silence. She whistled it again, patient, unhurried, and this time, from somewhere above, there was the unmistakable scrape of claws against old flooring, then stillness, then movement again. Cautious, deliberate, the sound of something large and careful working its way down a narrow iron stairwell, one step at a time. Cole Rayner made a sound that wasn't quite a word, and Marin held up a hand without turning around, because this moment didn't need 6 months of desperate relief crashing into a dog who had spent half a year surviving on instinct in an abandoned tower. Bishop came around the final turn of the stairwell into the gray light, thinner than the photographs on Cole Rayner's phone, his coat matted, his ribs visible, but alive, moving under his own power, his dark eyes fixed on Marin with an intensity that had nothing to do with recognizing her specifically and everything to do with recognizing the signal she'd given. The frequency his earliest training had taught him meant safety before anyone taught him anything else. He stopped 10 feet away and held perfectly still, the disciplined, watchful stance of an animal conditioned to wait for confirmation before standing down completely. And Marin understood that he needed one more piece of the signal before he would trust that this wasn't a trap. She knelt slowly on the packed dirt at the base of the tower, keeping her movements unhurried, and she said, in a voice pitched low and even, the same 2 words the old program had paired with that whistle, a phrase that meant nothing to anyone else standing on that ridge, but meant everything to a dog whose deepest training had been waiting 6 months to hear it. Stand down. Bishop's whole body seemed to exhale at once, the rigid posture dissolving into something looser, more exhausted, an animal finally given permission to stop holding a line no one else even knew he was holding. He crossed the last 10 feet at a slow, uneven walk, favoring his left front leg, and when he reached Marin, he pressed his full weight against her knees and went still, the way a soldier goes still when the extraction finally arrives. Cole Rayner was on his knees in the dirt a moment later, watching 6 months of exhaustion break across his face all at once, both hands in Bishop's matted coat, saying the dog's name over and over. Marin stayed where she was, one hand resting on Bishop's shoulder, giving the 2 of them the reunion that belonged to them, because she understood, better than most people ever would, that the person who finds someone isn't always the person that someone belongs to, and that was never the point. If this story reminded you that sometimes the answer was never lost, just waiting for the right person to ask the right question, subscribe and stay with us, because every week we bring you another story about the quiet ones who carried more than anyone knew, and those stories deserve to be told. Ruiz radioed in a recovery call, and within the hour a base veterinarian was kneeling in the dirt beside Bishop, checking his leg, his ribs, the dehydration that had clearly been building for weeks. Marin stepped back to give the professionals room to work, because that part had never been hers to finish, only to start. It was Ruiz who found her afterward, sitting on the tailgate of a truck while the light went gold and then gray over the ridge, and he asked how a cafe waitress had known the specific whistle and the specific 2 words a classified handling program used, because that wasn't something you picked up from overheard breakfast conversations, no matter how many months you'd been listening. Marin looked out at the ridge for a long moment, weighing the cost of saying it out loud against the cost of staying quiet, and decided that some truths only stayed heavy because you refused to ever set them down. Because I trained dogs like him once, she said, a long time ago, a different program, before I understood what it would cost me to keep doing that work. I left it behind because I thought that was the only way to stop carrying it. Turns out you don't actually stop carrying it, you just stop talking about it, and that's not the same thing at all. Ruiz didn't push for more. He asked instead if she'd consider helping the base's K9 program in some capacity, consulting, training support, anything that made use of what she still remembered. And Marin said she'd think about it, which was the most honest answer she had. She went back to the cafe 2 days later, tied her apron on at the usual hour, and for a while nothing about her daily rhythm seemed to have changed. But something had shifted underneath it, the way a foundation shifts without the house above it looking any different from the street. Cole Rayner started coming in most mornings again, the same black coffee, but he sat at the counter now instead of the window table, and some mornings he brought Bishop, recovering steadily, curling up on the floor with the loose, unguarded posture of an animal who had finally stopped holding a line. 6 weeks after the ridge, Marin stood behind her counter on an ordinary Tuesday morning, watching Cole Rayner scratch behind Bishop's ears while he waited for his coffee, and she understood something she hadn't let herself understand in over a decade of quiet. The years she'd spent trying to leave that work behind hadn't been wasted, because everything she'd learned in them had been sitting there the whole time, waiting for the moment it would matter enough to speak up. She had built a small life out of staying unnoticed, and it had taken a missing dog and a stranger's grief to remind her that some skills you don't lose. You just set them down for a while, and they're still there, waiting, whenever the right moment asks you to pick them back up. If this story reminded you that the quiet ones are often the ones who see the most, subscribe and stay with us, because we've got more stories like this waiting to be told, and we're not going to stop telling them.